I thought my father didn't care. A stranger proved me wrong, but it was too late. For 54 years, I believed my father simply didn't care about me. Not once. Then, on the day we buried him, a stranger walked up to his grave and said something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my father. By the time the funeral ended, the cemetery had almost emptied. David Carter stood beside the fresh mound of earth, his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his black coat, while the last of the mourners drifted toward their cars. The minister had spoken about kindness. Former students remembered Arthur's discipline. Neighbors talked about his generosity. Everyone seemed to know exactly who Arthur Carter had been. Everyone except his own son. A voice behind him broke the silence. Arthur Carter? David turned. An elderly man stood a few yards away, holding a faded baseball cap against his chest. His denim work jacket still carried grease stains that no amount of washing had ever removed. "I'm sorry. Am I too late?" "The service just ended." The old man nodded, walked to the grave, removed his cap, and stood there without speaking for several long seconds. Then he smiled. "Well, you stubborn old fool." The words sounded rough. Somehow, they also sounded affectionate. "I guess you beat me here after all." He stood quietly before adding, "You changed my life." David frowned. "I'm sorry. Your father, he changed my life." David searched the man's face. "I don't think we've met." "No. I'm David." "I know. My father's son." "I know. My father taught history for 30 years." The old man smiled. "That's what he got paid for." After a brief pause, he looked back at the grave. "What he really did was fix things." David nodded. He was always fixing something. The old man slipped his cap back on. "I should let you get back to your family." "Wait." He stopped. "How did you know him?" A faint smile crossed his face. "He repaired something for me." David almost smiled. "That sounds like him." The old man glanced toward the old blue pickup parked near the cemetery gate. "I'm not talking about my truck." Then he walked away. David watched until the pickup disappeared through the cemetery gates. Through the reception, people stopped David every few minutes. "Your dad drove through a snowstorm to fix our furnace. He stayed after school every Thursday helping my grandson pass history. He never let me pay him." David smiled, shook hands, thanked them, and laughed whenever they laughed. But after every conversation, the feeling stayed exactly the same. These weren't just stories. They were memories. Memories he didn't share. The Arthur they described was patient, funny, and steady. The Arthur David remembered was simply quiet. His father had never been cruel. He never raised his voice, never drank, and never forgot to pick him up after baseball practice. He simply never seemed to know what to say. Whenever David borrowed the pickup or headed home after a visit, Arthur almost always had the same two words: "Drive safe." Nothing more. When David was 13, his little league team lost the championship. He struck out in his final at-bat and cried the entire drive home. Arthur drove in silence. That evening, David placed his participation trophy on the kitchen table and waited. Arthur glanced at it. "Put it somewhere it won't get broken." Then he walked into the garage. That was all. At 13, David decided his father didn't care very much. At 54, he still believed it. Late that afternoon, David unlocked the side door of the house his father had lived in alone for the past several years. The silence felt unfamiliar. Arthur's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. A crossword puzzle lay half-finished on the kitchen table. His coffee mug still sat in the sink. Nothing looked different, except Arthur wasn't coming back. Someone had to begin clearing the house. David grabbed an empty cardboard box and carried it into the garage. The fluorescent lights buzzed before flickering on. Everything sat exactly where it belonged. Wrenches hung in neat rows. Coffee cans labeled bolts. Washers and nails lined the shelves. The workbench looked ready for another Monday morning. David opened one cabinet. Nothing unexpected. As he reached toward the top shelf, something slipped free. A narrow black notebook landed at his feet. Its cover was cracked, the corners dark with grease. David picked it up. The first page looked exactly like a mechanic's notebook. 78 Ford. Oil filter. Pickup bearings. By mower belt. Transmission leak. He turned the page. Tom. Roof after storm. Mrs. Wilson. Porch light. Emily. Bird seed. Another page followed. Brake pads. Garden hose. Call plumber. There didn't seem to be any system. Machines. People. Machines again. People again. As though his father had never believed there needed to be one. David kept turning pages until one name appeared again. And then again. Frank Miller. The notes never changed. Truck. Tomatoes. Interview. Thursday. No explanations. No stories. Just reminders. David looked around the silent garage before lowering his eyes to the notebook once more. For the first time since the funeral, he wanted to know who Arthur Carter really was. The next morning, David couldn't stop thinking about one name. Frank Miller. It appeared more often than anyone else's. Truck. Tomatoes. Interview. Thursday. For words. No explanations. Just reminders. Frank lived less than 20 miles away. The white clapboard house looked older than David remembered. A faded American flag hung beside the front door, and the same blue pickup from the cemetery sat quietly in the driveway. David hadn't even reached the porch before the front door opened. Frank smiled. "I figured you'd show up." "You did." He shrugged. "Your father would have." David wasn't sure what that meant. He held up the notebook. "I found this in Dad's garage." Opening it to a familiar page, he turned it toward Frank. Frank Miller. Truck. Tomatoes. Interview. Frank studied the handwriting for several seconds before a faint smile crossed his face. "I'd recognize Arthur's handwriting anywhere." David waited. Frank closed the notebook gently. "So, you've started asking questions." They sat at an old kitchen table worn smooth by decades of use. Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee. Black. No sugar. Just the way Arthur liked it. David opened the notebook again. "I've been trying to make sense of all this." Frank nodded. "So did I." "You did." Instead of answering immediately, Frank pointed to one page. Spark plugs. Brake pads. Then another. Emily. Bird seed. "I never understood why some things ended up in here. And some people did too." He smiled. "I figured maybe Emily's furnace had broken." David looked up. It hadn't. Frank shook his head. Her husband had died. Silence settled over the kitchen. Frank rested one finger on the notebook. Sometimes it really was a truck. He looked at David. Sometimes it wasn't. David's eyes wandered around the room. Fishing photographs. A Navy portrait. Pictures of grandchildren. One photograph stood out above the others. Arthur and Frank. Much younger. Covered in grease. Laughing. David couldn't remember ever seeing his father laugh like that. "When was this taken?" Frank followed his gaze. "The day I got sober." "I thought Dad fixed your truck." "He did. That's how we met." Frank wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "My wife left. I started drinking. I lost my job. Eventually, I stopped answering the phone. Then my truck quit too." He smiled to himself. Seemed about right. A neighbor told him about a mechanic on Maple Street. "So I drove over." Frank looked down into his coffee. "Your father never asked why I was there. He just looked under the hood and said, 'Come back Thursday.'" Frank chuckled softly. Longest sentence I heard him say for weeks. David couldn't help smiling. "I picked up the truck, paid him, and figured that was the end of it." Frank looked toward the window. "But the next Thursday, he knocked on my door. He said, 'Just checking the repair.' There wasn't anything wrong with the truck. So why'd he come?" Frank shrugged. "I never asked." After a moment, he smiled. "He just kept coming. Every Thursday. Sometimes he said he thought he heard the engine. Sometimes he wanted to make sure it was still running right. Frank laughed quietly. The truck was always fine. David lowered his eyes to the notebook. Truck. Then, tomatoes. Then, interview. His thumb rested on the page. Frank noticed. The tomatoes came from his garden. He'd bring over a paper sack. Leave half with me. Drink 1 cup of coffee. Then head home. He smiled. Never stayed long. David looked at the word again. Tomatoes. Now it meant something. What about this one? He pointed at the notebook. Interview. Frank nodded. I finally got a job interview. The night before, my truck wouldn't start. I was ready to cancel. What happened? I opened my front door at 6 that morning, and your father was already underneath it. David blinked. He didn't explain. He just said, thought you'd need this today. That was it. Did you get the job? Frank smiled. I stayed there 23 years. As David stepped outside, something caught his eye. A rough weld stretched across one corner of the pickup's front bumper. Uneven, unpainted, solid. Frank walked over and rested his hand on it. You noticed? David ran his fingers across the steel. My father did this 12 years ago. Frank knocked lightly on the bumper. The steel answered with a clean, solid ring. He looked at it and said, Frank grinned. Ugly weld. A beat. Still holds. David laughed. I told him I'd pay extra if he'd make it prettier. Frank laughed too. You know what he said? David shook his head. Pretty don't pull trailers. The two men stood quietly beside the old truck. Neither seemed in any hurry to leave. Finally, David thanked him and started back toward his car. As he drove away, he glanced once in the mirror. Frank was still standing beside the pickup, one hand resting lightly on that old weld. A few days later, David found himself standing outside a small brick house on the edge of town. Emily Brooks lived there alone. He knocked. A moment later, the front door opened, and an elderly woman looked at him through the screen. Can I help you? My name's David Carter. She waited politely. I'm Arthur's son. Her expression softened immediately. Oh, her eyes drifted toward the driveway. I was wondering why I hadn't seen his truck. David lowered his gaze. He passed away last week. Emily nodded slowly. I'm sorry. So am I. She opened the door. Come on in. The house felt lived in. Not especially tidy. Not especially messy. Just quiet. A knitting basket rested beside an old recliner. Yesterday's newspaper lay folded next to a pair of reading glasses. Near the front window stood a wooden bird feeder filled with fresh seed. David noticed it. Emily smiled. That used to lean. He looked closer. My father fixed it. He said the birds probably didn't care. She smiled at the memory. Maybe not, but I do. David smiled. That sounded exactly like Arthur. Emily filled the kettle while neither of them felt any need to rush the conversation. When she returned with 2 cups of tea, David laid the notebook on the table. I found this. She looked at the worn black cover and smiled. Arthur always carried something like that. Did he ever tell you what he wrote in it? She shook her head. He wasn't much for explaining himself. David turned a few pages until one note caught his attention. George. Hospital. He looked up. George. My husband. David glanced back at the page while Emily stirred her tea. After George passed away, the house got awfully big. I'd leave the television on just to hear another voice. A faint smile crossed her face. Every now and then I'd hear Arthur's pickup pull into the driveway. He'd find something to fix, fill the bird feeder, drink 1 cup of coffee, then head home. David looked around the room. What was broken? Emily laughed softly. Usually? Nothing. The two of them sat quietly for a moment. Then Emily smiled again. Sometimes I'd leave him something. A loose hinge. A gate that didn't quite close. So he'd come by? I suppose so. David smiled. You think he knew? Emily looked into her teacup before answering. Oh, he knew. He just never let on. David glanced back toward the bird feeder. One hook leaned slightly to one side. Without thinking, he reached over and straightened it. Emily noticed. She smiled. Neither of them said a word. As they finished their tea, Emily spoke again. "Sometimes I'd ask about you." David looked surprised. "You did?" She nodded. He'd usually say, "He's doing all right." David smiled. "Sounds like him." Emily rested one hand on the table. "There was one afternoon when I told him you worked too much. He didn't answer. He reached into his wallet, looked at something, and smiled." David frowned. "What was it?" She shook her head. "I couldn't see." He slipped the wallet back into his pocket, picked up his screwdriver, and asked if my gate was still sticking. David thanked her and stepped outside. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine. The notebook rested open on the passenger seat. He didn't turn another page. For years, he'd believed his father simply had nothing to say. Now, he wasn't so sure. He closed the notebook and rested one hand on its worn cover. Then he started the engine. For the first time since the funeral, he wondered whether he'd ever really known Arthur Carter at all. The garage felt different. Nothing had moved. Yet somehow, everything had changed. David picked up another cardboard box and went back to sorting. Without thinking, he bent down, picked up a rusty nail from the floor, and carried it to the vise. 3 quick taps of the hammer. Straight. He dropped it into the coffee can marked nails. "Come." He reached for another box, then stopped. The hammer was still in his hand. He looked at the coffee can and realized he hadn't decided to save the nail. He'd simply done it, exactly the way his father always had. When David was 16, he'd laughed. "Dad, it's a 10-cent nail." Arthur never looked up. He straightened it, dropped it into the can, and went right back to work. At the time, David thought it was just another one of his father's odd habits. Standing alone in the garage now, he realized he'd inherited it without ever noticing. He opened an old metal document box beneath the workbench. Owner's manuals, tax returns, warranty papers. As he lifted a stack of folders, something slipped onto the bench. A faded Little League photograph. Him, 13 years old, one knee stained with dirt, squinting into the afternoon sun. The championship game. The day he struck out. The day he cried all the way home. He turned the photograph over. Nothing. No note. No date. Just the picture. He laid it beside the notebook. Behind another folder lay his wedding program. Then a newspaper clipping. Local student graduates with honors. His name had been circled in blue ink. David stared at it for a long moment before placing it beside the photograph. He picked up the notebook once more. The final page held only a few words. Thursday. Frank. Tomatoes. Emily. Furnace filter. Nothing else. The next page was blank. He closed the notebook. That was the last page. Near the bottom of the box, one final photograph caught his eye. A hospital room. David holding newborn Michael. Arthur stood a few feet away, half turned toward them. He flipped the picture over. 4 words. Looks tired. Keeps going. David read them once. Then again, quietly, he placed the photograph beside the others. A car door closed outside. "Dad." Michael stepped into the garage. "You still working?" "Almost finished." Michael smiled as he looked around. "I always liked hanging out here with Grandpa." "So did he," David said. Michael laughed. "He always had me handing him the wrong wrench." David smiled. "I think he did that to everybody." They packed the last few boxes together. At one point, Michael picked up the old coffee can. "You still save bent nails?" David looked at it and smiled. "I guess I do." By late afternoon, the garage was almost empty. Michael carried the last box to his car while David followed behind. "Thanks." "Of course." Michael opened the driver's door. Without thinking, David said, "Drive safe." Michael smiled. "I will." He climbed inside and closed the door. David stood quietly in the driveway as the yard settled back into silence. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower droned steadily. He looked down. A little rust from the old nail still clung to his fingertips. Slowly, he rubbed it away. The engine started. Michael reached for the gear shift. Michael! His son looked back and switched off the engine. What is it? David walked over and opened the driver's door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he pulled his son into an awkward embrace. His arms tightened, just a little. I love you, son. Michael hugged him back without hesitation. I love you too, Dad. David stepped away. Michael smiled one last time, then drove off. David watched until the car disappeared around the corner. Evening settled over the house. David returned to the garage one last time. The notebook, the Little League photograph, the graduation clipping, the wedding program, the hospital picture. He gathered them carefully into a single stack and placed them back inside the document box. He slid the box onto the shelf, turned off the light, pulled the garage door closed. For 54 years, I'd been waiting to hear my father say, I love you. I just never realized I'd already heard it.